Welcome back to beyoungministry.blogspot.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Today we continue our study in the Gospel according to Luke. We're in chapter 6, verses 31 through 36, which reads, "Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." That's Luke chapter 6, verses 31 through 36. The Lord Jesus has now separated the 12 disciples, and now He is teaching them about His love, the kind of love that loves enemies. In Luke 6, we have the Sermon on the Mount. It is a sermon about discipleship. Therein we learn that the distinguishing mark of the disciple of the Lord Jesus is His love for His enemies. In verse 31, we know it as the golden rule. And just as you want people to treat you, treat them in the same way. Just as you want people to treat you, treat them in the same way. That's the golden rule. The golden rule is a singularly Christian idea. Every other religion in the world teaches a form of the golden rule. It is exclusively Christian. In verse 32 through 34, the Lord Jesus says, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full." Notice the word sinners. This is a technical term for an unbeliever. It's a word referring to the wicked in some cases. It can refer to the wicked in general. When Paul says, "I am the chief of sinners," he is using this term to define all sinners. It can also be used to speak of people who are particularly wicked, who do vile things. It is used both in the Old Testament and the New Testament to define people who do not have a personal relationship with God and subsequently do not belong to Him. Sinners have a certain kind of love, and here it's laid out. In verse 32, sinners love those who love them. In verse 33, sinners do good to those who do good to them. In verse 34, sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back in full payment. Sinners have reciprocal love. Their love is conditioned by how they are treated. But God's kind of love is very different than that, isn't it? In fact, if you love, according to verse 32, those who love you, what credit is that to you? You see, that's the way sinners love. And if you do good only to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Interestingly, the word used for credit here is the Greek word charis. It's the word from which we get our idea of grace. What grace do you demonstrate when you love like sinners? It is the grace of God that sets him and his followers apart. God's kind of love is kind and merciful. Kind in verse 35, merciful in verse 36. Kind is positive, merciful is negative. Kind means I give you what you do not deserve. Merciful means I withhold what you do deserve. The active love of God is kind. He makes the sun to rise on the just and the unjust. He makes the rain to fall on all. That's kindness. He's kind toward all of us with his compassion, his goodness, his patience, his forbearance, his invitations. And there's a passive kind of kindness. He's passive in the sense of his mercy. He withholds judgment. He withholds condemnation. He withholds damnation. In verse 35, the Lord Jesus repeats again this command. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. The very three things he mentions in verses 32 through 34, the Lord Jesus picks right back up in verse 35. And if we love them, according to verse 35, then your reward will be great, the Lord Jesus says. Back in verse 32, the Lord Jesus brought attention to the fact that there will be a reward. When we love sinners the way sinners are not used to being loved, asking no love in return, we are showing them a love that is God's love, and our reward will be great. That reward is discovered in verse 35, and you will be children of the Most High. This means those being loved are going to conclude you're a child of God. He's not talking about what God is going to give us when we get to heaven. He's talking about what men are going to think. They're going to say, he or she is godlike. The words Most High in verse 35 is a New Testament equivalent to the Hebrew El Elyon, or God Most High, which means you're the sovereign ruler. Interestingly, the Lord Jesus called the Son of the Most High in Luke 1:32 and 76. Further, in verse 36, the Lord Jesus added, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. When we love like God, we adorn the gospel. We demonstrate that the life of God is in us, and his supernatural ability to love is shown through us. So when we are kind and being good toward our enemies, and being merciful and withholding judgment from our enemies, we are being like God. As a result, we are identified by them as the children of the Most High, of the Most High God. Finally, those who taste God's grace but refuse to share it are tortured by anger, bitterness, and revenge. But for the one who tastes God's mercy and gives it to others, the reward is a blessed liberation. The prison door is thrown open and the prisoner is set free. And do you know what? We find the face of God who forgave us in the faces of our enemies. Then our enemies and ourselves are set free. My friends, I trust this podcast is helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.